What if the person you trusted most was the one planning your downfall? She gave everything, her love, her loyalty, her future, believing she was building a life with the right person. But behind closed doors, secrets were growing, lies were stacking, and betrayal was already in motion. The moment the truth is exposed, everything changes. The heartbreak is real, but so is her strength. Because instead of falling apart, she rises, stronger, smarter, and ready to take back everything that was almost stolen from her. This isn't just a story about betrayal.
This confidential information clearly
power,
shows Mr.
awakening,
Harrison's
and
involvement in the
unstoppable
illicit
revenge.
transactions.
The lesson? Trust your instincts. They see what your heart tries to ignore. Not everyone who stands beside you is on your side. And sometimes, losing someone is exactly how you find yourself again. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the motivation to bring more powerful stories like this in the future. Thanks for watching.
The auditorium was still dark when my husband Julian walked to the stage to begin his keynote at the Future Forward Summit, offered a confident grin to 500 of Silicon Valley's tech elite, and gave a knowing look to his pregnant lead designer in the front row. His father, a legendary venture capitalist, was sitting right beside me. Our 12-year-old son was at our table, and a key investor who had just featured Julian on a magazine cover was only feet away. I just sat there, my phone cold in my hand, and one single thought pulsed in my mind. I already knew. I knew, and it still felt like the air had been forced from my lungs. He thought this quiet public acknowledgement of their new family would break me. He expected I'd cry, make a quiet exit, and dissolve while he seamlessly merged her into his world. He was wrong. Because what no one in that massive auditorium knew, not him, not her, not his investors, was that I had already sent an encrypted file to a journalist from Wired, and before his keynote on AI and authentic human connection was over, the Valley would learn about every secret he thought was buried in layers of code. This is the story of how a supportive wife became the source code for his downfall. Here is a lesson for everyone. Your composure is not your weakness. Your silence is not your surrender. And the moment you decide to take control of the narrative is the moment your true power is activated. If you have ever been made to feel like a background process by the one person who swore to build a life with you, this story is for you. If this account of events makes your heart race, if it ignites a fire in your spirit, if you feel a profound sense of recognition, please do one thing for me tonight. Hit that subscribe button. Not for my own validation, but for the next person who needs to find this story when they are feeling lost at 3 in the morning. Every subscription, every like, and every share helps this message reach someone sitting in the dark, wondering if they are the one going crazy. They are not, and your click might just be the signal that proves it. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what you would have done in that cavernous auditorium. We read every single one. The auditorium was still dark when my husband used his keynote speech to introduce his pregnant mistress to the tech world. 500 people, my father-in-law, my 12-year-old son, a major investor. And I just sat there, phone in my lap, thinking, I knew, and I still wasn't prepared. But let's rewind to the beginning because the ultimate betrayal wasn't that speech. It started a year before, on a Tuesday, with a single anomalous spike in our home network's data usage I was never meant to investigate. To the outside world, Dr. Elena Vance lived a life optimized for success. A stunning glass-walled home in Pacific Heights with views of the Golden Gate Bridge. A husband, Julian, the celebrated pioneer of a revolutionary AI empire. A 12-year-old son named Daniel who was already writing his own code at his prestigious academy. And her own respected career as the director of a nonprofit, bringing tech literacy to underserved communities. It was a life of impeccable design. But from the inside, Elena had begun to detect a bug in the system. It started with small data points that didn't sync, the kind you ignore because to question them means risking a system-wide crash. Julian claiming he was pulling an all-nighter at the server farm in Santa Clara, but rideshare receipts showing a 2 a.m. drop-off in Hayes Valley. Julian coming home smelling not of stale office air and caffeine, but of a particular artisanal coffee brewed only at a small cafe near his lead designer's apartment. Julian's personal finances suddenly migrating from their shared portfolio to a series of heavily encrypted crypto wallets she had no access to. She told herself she was overthinking the data. She told herself that 15 years of marriage had earned him a certain level of trust. She reasoned that a partnership was an active commitment, not a passive state, and Julian was simply under unimaginable pressure with the company's upcoming IPO. Then Daniel said something that shattered her firewall of denial. They were having dinner, just the two of them, on a Friday. Julian was supposedly in a critical pre-IPO meeting with the board. Daniel was running a new script he'd written to analyze their smart home security logs when he looked up, his expression more curious than concerned. He asked, "Mom, why does Chloe from Dad's design team keep getting logged as a frequent visitor on the front gate camera? The timestamps are always after midnight." Elena managed a casual tone, suggesting it was probably late-night work sessions. But long after Daniel went to his room, Elena stood in her sleek quartz kitchen, gripping the countertop until her fingers ached. The smart faucet ran and ran. She didn't cry. She didn't call a friend. She just stood there thinking, since when did I start beta testing lies on my own son? On the first Thursday of every month, the Crofts held court at a minimalist Michelin-starred restaurant in Soma, where Julian's father, a legendary venture capitalist who had seeded half of Silicon Valley, presided over the family. He was a formidable man who spoke only of disruption, scale, and exit strategies. Julian's mother was ever present, a masterclass in networking and ruthless efficiency. After the market analysis, there was the performance of power and influence, and Julian would play the part of the devoted husband to perfection. He would put his arm around Elena's waist for a photo, kiss her temple, and murmur something like, "This woman is the entire operating system for my success." And Elena would smile, because that was her function in this complex program. Smile, support, remain silent, and project absolute confidence. Let me tell you something about the degradation of a connection. The breaking point isn't when the arguments begin, it's when you realize you're no longer communicating, you're just exchanging status updates. It's when your husband's touch feels less like intimacy and more like he's adjusting your position for a better camera angle. Pay attention to that feeling, not because you should be paranoid, but because you deserve to be truly seen by the person who promised to co-author a life with you. Elena's closest friend was a woman named Sarah, a cybersecurity expert as direct and analytical as Elena was diplomatic and composed. Sarah was the kind of friend who would meet for coffee, take one look at Elena's tired eyes and say, "Okay, kill the process. The serene tech wife interface is glitching." They would both share a strained laugh, but the diagnosis would land like a lead weight in Elena's stomach, its accuracy echoing for hours. It was Sarah who found the first piece of irrefutable proof. Elena had asked her to help set up a new, highly secure server for her nonprofit, a task that required a brief audit of her home network to ensure there were no vulnerabilities. While running a diagnostic, Sarah flagged a massive, recurring, and heavily encrypted data packet being uploaded nightly to an external IP address. It was routed from a hidden partition on Julian's personal server, labeled simply Project Nightingale. Sarah sat in her high-tech home office overlooking the bay and stared at the data flow map for a full 10 minutes. Then she made a secure, isolated clone of the partition, wiped the system logs clean, and spent the next 3 days feeling like she was disarming a bomb. She tried to construct an innocent hypothesis. Maybe it was a secret prototype for a new product. Maybe it was a fail-safe backup for his core algorithm. Maybe Project Nightingale was some radical new software, but her gut told her otherwise. It's an instinct that successful people develop, a deep certainty when the data doesn't match the story. On a Tuesday evening, over tea at a quiet cafe, Sarah turned her laptop toward Elena. Elena studied the screen showing the data transfers. Her face lost all color, but her hands were perfectly steady. She set her cup down, took a slow breath, and said, "It's probably a confidential project. He's protecting the intellectual property before the IPO." Sarah leaned in, her voice low but sharp. "Elena, these packets contain fragmented audio and video files. The destination IP address resolves to a private cloud storage account registered to Chloe Sterling. And Project Nightingale isn't a piece of software. It's the code name for the smart nursery they're designing for their new condo in the Mission. I decrypted one of the audio files. It's a 2-hour recording of his heartbeat to be used for the baby's sound machine. A $60,000 payment to a shell corporation called Aura Designs would have raised alarms. Julian would never approve a vendor payment like that without a detailed invoice. Maybe it was time to stop finding creative explanations for a man who was so clearly building something off the books. The silence in their Gold Coast penthouse was thick with unspoken acquisitions. Clara expertly steered the conversation to their daughter Sophia's upcoming school art fair. Her friend Chloe let her, knowing that sometimes friendship is about admiring the artist's vision, and other times it's about letting the paint dry. But later that night, with Sophia asleep and the city lights glittering below, Clara opened her laptop. She didn't bother checking their shared wealth management portal. Julian's digital fortress was legendary. Instead, she typed Isabelle Laurent, Chicago architect, into the search bar of a global design archive. The pounding in her chest felt like a structural flaw. It was just a professional collaboration, she told herself. There had to be a reasonable explanation. She was letting the pregnancy hormones make her irrational. When you find a brushstroke that contradicts the artist's known technique, your first instinct is to question the painting's attribution. That isn't denial. It's due diligence applied to self-preservation. Denial demands you ignore the evidence. Self-preservation searches for a better explanation. And Clara had been finding better explanations for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to accept an ugly truth. But the awards were real. The architect's name was real. And somewhere in a sleek design studio across the Chicago River, a woman Clara had never met was executing a vision funded by her husband. Clara moved through the next 2 weeks in a haze. She chaired a museum acquisitions committee, negotiated the loan of a priceless sculpture, and helped Sophia build a clay model of the solar system, all while her own carefully curated world was collapsing in on itself. The effort was exhausting. It felt like trying to restore a fresco while the wall was crumbling. On a Friday evening, she made a choice that felt both like a betrayal and a necessity. She called an old acquaintance from her grad school days who now did opposition research for a rival real estate development firm. She lied, saying she was planning a surprise feature for Julian in a major architectural magazine, celebrating his latest skyscraper, his triumph. In reality, she needed to see the unvarnished blueprints of his life, because the polished version he presented to her felt increasingly like a clever forgery. Julian was the celebrated founder of Thorn Properties, a company whose smart buildings were redefining the city's skyline. Clara, a renowned art curator, had graced countless charity balls on his arm, but she had never once looked into his private project servers. It felt like trespassing in a private gallery. She was looking for early concept sketches for the magazine feature when she found it. A payment authorization from his encrypted financial channel, clearly not meant for public viewing, was filed in a folder mislabeled HVAC upgrades. The line item read, IL Phase 3 Residential Suite. It was followed by a series of invoices from a high-end European supplier for medical-grade air filtration systems and custom-built neonatal equipment, all shipping to a private penthouse in River North. Clara felt a cold, calculated dread, like watching a masterpiece be authenticated as a fake. She knew Julian's firm had recently retained a brilliant architect from Paris for a new luxury development. A quick search of his company's new project partners confirmed her name, Isabelle Laurent. The final delivery was scheduled for 11 a.m. the next day. Clara, parked in her car at a cafe across the street, watched Julian's matte black Bentley glide into the building's private garage. A few moments later, Isabelle Laurent emerged from the lobby, a woman whose style was as sharp and modern as her buildings. Hanging from her shoulder was a custom leather satchel containing a portable rendering tablet Clara recognized from Julian's recent tech investments. A $25,000 piece of hardware carried as casually as a notebook. A wave of nausea washed over her. Julian appeared from the garage and met Isabelle with a quiet word, placing a hand on the curve of her stomach with a gesture of ownership as he guided her back inside. Clara did not look away. She just watched, the curator in her assessing the composition and form, while the wife inside her felt the canvas of her own life being torn. She took out the latest 3D ultrasound scan of her own baby, tucked inside her planner, and stared at the tiny, developing life as the world she had so carefully constructed shattered in the quiet of her car. She didn't drive back to their penthouse. She drove to the museum, letting herself into the still, dark gallery, the skyline a glittering testament to the future she had thought was hers. She sat there for an hour, the low hum of the climate control her only companion, staring at the blank gallery walls, the ultrasound picture cold in her hand. Finally, she called her brother, Alex. "I authenticated his side project," she said, her voice empty. "There's another woman." A long pause stretched across the line. "Clara, are you sure? It could be an anonymous client. You're pregnant. You're under immense pressure." "She's pregnant, Alex. And he was building her a private maternity ward, like she's his new masterpiece." The calm, lawyerly tone disappeared from Alex's voice, replaced by a cold fury. "Clara, you spot forgeries for a living. You don't misinterpret details. The fact that he has you doubting your own expertise is the most toxic element in this entire composition." Clara hung up. She went home, ordered sushi, and kissed Julian when he came through the door close to midnight, his suit jacket carrying a faint, elegant trace of a perfume she didn't own. The performance was flawless. That night, as he breathed evenly beside her, she wondered, is our whole marriage just a long-term development he plans to flip? The following 2 weeks were the loneliest of Clara's life. She didn't hire a private eye. She didn't have a screaming match. She avoided every dramatic trope. In reality, betrayal was a quiet, methodical process of discovery. It was the 2 a.m. search for precedent in asset division for intellectual property created during a marriage that made her feel invisible. The stress made her forget the prenatal vitamins her doctor had lectured her about. She brutally dismantled a junior curator's proposal over a minor dating error, then went to her office and pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window to keep from crying. She almost told her father during their weekly call, but couldn't bear the disappointment, so she discussed the art market in post-war Europe instead. She accidentally sent a message meant for Alex to a group chat for a museum fundraiser. It just said, "Any idea what her timeline is?" A full minute of heart-pounding terror went by before she could add, "Disregard. That was about the auctioneer's schedule. My apologies." 2 board members replied with a thumbs up. Alex sent a private message almost instantly. "Whose schedule, Clara? Whose?" Clara texted back, "Cataloging the collection. Will advise on total value." And a small, bitter laugh escaped her. It was her older brother who knew the exhibit was a lie. He came over to help her install the new smart home security panel that Julian had been too busy to oversee. Alex never pressed. He was a corporate attorney, a man who showed love through airtight contracts and litigation strategy. He took one look at his sister, at the new fragility around her eyes, and said, "My firm's resources are your resources." Before leaving, he placed a heavy, leather-bound book on marital asset law on her coffee table, a silent gesture that said, "I'm here when you're ready to file." It was Alex who moved things forward. He had a connection, a woman named Sophia Rossi, a forensic accountant known for being the best at discreetly untangling the finances of Chicago's wealthiest couples. Alex arranged the meeting, telling Clara he was taking her to lunch to discuss setting up a family trust for Sophia. When they arrived at the quiet restaurant and Sophia was already at a corner table with a laptop and a thin file, Clara gave her brother a knowing look. "This isn't about the trust." "No," Alex said. "It's about protecting your assets. Sit." Alex slid his tablet across the gleaming surface of the conference room table. On the screen was a deed of trust. "Look," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Maybe he has a legitimate reason for a blind trust, but legitimate reasons rarely involve a $4 million penthouse on the river that you know nothing about." Clara stared at the address, the air leaving her lungs. "I don't want to be the kind of wife who investigates her own husband." Alex tapped the screen, bringing up a bank statement. "You're a curator, Clara," he said gently. "You spend your life determining what's real and what's fake. You're just authenticating your most significant holding." "Precisely," Sophia added from her side of the table, her voice calm and clear. "I'm not here to confirm your fears. I'm here to provide you with facts. There is a profound difference." Clara looked at her brother, whose face was a mask of cold resolve. "Okay," she breathed. "Find it all." Alex nodded, his fingers moving with practiced speed across the keyboard. "You'll have the report by morning." He paused. "And look, if this is all just some crazy, paranoid misunderstanding, I'll happily eat the cost of the deep dive analysis." It was not a misunderstanding. By dawn, Alex had sent an encrypted file. It was a digital blueprint of a betrayal. Encrypted payment logs showed recurring wire transfers to a high-end fertility clinic, not the one Amelia used. A digital lease agreement for a luxury apartment in Sausalito registered to an anonymous shell corporation. Then, the final piece that made Amelia's blood run cold, an anonymous email containing a single attachment. It was an ultrasound image clearly dated with the name Maya Vance and a gestational age, putting her 9 weeks ahead of Amelia. The sender's message was a single devastating sentence. He calls her Project Genesis. Maya Vance was their company's new, brilliant lead scientist. He wasn't just launching a new product line, he was launching a new life. She stood, sent a single encrypted confirmed message back to Alex, and walked into her state-of-the-art home lab in Palo Alto. This was the one place on Earth that was entirely her own creation. It was well past midnight, and she looked out the panoramic window at the distant, glittering lights of San Francisco. She sat there in her ergonomic chair, the place she'd spent thousands of hours for the last 5 years, and she let out a silent scream. It was a raw, internal implosion that vaporized the life she had so carefully engineered. Then her composure returned, frigid and precise. She dialed Catherine's number. "I need you," she said, her voice like a fractured crystal. "I'm on my way," Catherine answered immediately. No questions asked. She just came. The weeks between that night and the annual Bio Innovators Gala passed in a blur of focused, icy calm. She oversaw clinical trials. She finalized research papers. She sent Alex one-word progress reports. She would confront Ethan at the gala. She would be immaculate. She would present her data, demand a clean split of the intellectual property, and protect her child from the fallout. She had a strategy. The strategy was her shield against the ruthless ambition of Silicon Valley's elite. The strategy was a complete work of fiction. The night of the Bio Innovators Gala, Amelia was in their Pacific Heights penthouse by 5 o'clock, a vision in sapphire silk that draped perfectly over her 7-month baby bump. Ethan's big night, and hers as well. She had architected every facet of their life, from the minimalist art on their walls to the venture capitalists on the guest list for this very event. She had even personally overseen the research grant sponsored by their company. 22 pioneers would be honored. Ethan was a lock for the Visionary of the Year award. He was all focused charm and intense eye contact, a jarring shift from his recent emotional unavailability. He kept his hand on her lower back, a warm, possessive anchor. He told her she was stunning, his muse, 3 times before their self-driving car even arrived. He told her best friend Catherine that she looked powerful and shook her brother Alex's hand, with the practiced grip of a man closing a Series C funding round. The entire performance was so flawless, so utterly convincing, that Amelia almost let the knot of ice in her stomach begin to thaw. Almost. She saw him glance at a second, unfamiliar smartwatch twice during the opening reception. She watched him step onto the terrace to take a call, and when he returned, his face was flushed with a strange, triumphant glow. Not pre-speech jitters. Triumph, like a founder who just secured a 10-figure valuation. The award ceremony began. The Institute director's voice flowed through the grand hall, a smooth narrative of disruption, innovation, and progress. Everyone clapped. Then Ethan's name was called. He stood, kissed her on the cheek, and strode to the stage. He accepted the award, a polished titanium helix she'd helped design. He owned the room. Amelia's chest tightened with a twisted sense of pride. He was about to thank her, his brilliant wife, his partner in science. But his speech, projected onto the massive screens flanking the stage, took a shocking turn. "Innovation is about building the future," Ethan said, his voice confident and rehearsed. "And I've recently begun my most important project. I have met someone, her name is Maya, and she is giving me the gift of a son." He walked to the edge of the stage and held out his hand. From a table near the front, Maya Vance, their star scientist, rose into the spotlight. Her silver dress clung to a pregnancy just as advanced as Amelia's, and she looked up at him with unadulterated adoration. Ethan put his arm around her waist and faced the thunderstruck silence of Silicon Valley. "I know the timing is unconventional," he announced, "but my life's work is built on radical transparency. I hope you will all welcome us as we begin this new venture together." The silence that followed was a crushing physical weight, pulling the very air from the room. A server dropped a tray of champagne flutes, the crash echoing like a gunshot off the polished concrete floors. Her brother, Alex, shot out of his chair with a violent scrape of wood. The Institute director's face was a pale, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Her best friend, Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes blazing with a cold fury. And Amelia, 7 months pregnant, sitting at the head table of honor, looked at the man on stage, her husband, with his arm around another pregnant woman, and could only think, what was the variable I missed? She did not scream, she did not cry or hurl her water glass. She sat perfectly still, a stillness born not of poise, but of the absolute void in the eye of a hurricane. The room began to distort, the architectural lighting blurring into abstract streaks, her own heart pounding a deafening rhythm against her ribs. A single, terrifyingly clear thought cut through the chaos. I am going to go into premature labor at the California Academy of Sciences, and TechCrunch will have the story by morning. Radical transparency. That was the buzzword he'd used for months while building his shadow company and methodically executing their life. The hypocrisy was so profound she felt she could suffocate on it. Catherine grabbed Amelia's arm under the table. "We are walking out of here, right now," she hissed, her voice a steel blade. But Amelia was paralyzed, watching her entire universe be publicly dismantled. Then, something inside her didn't break, but reset. A cold, diamond-hard resolve. She stood up, her spine like a titanium rod. She walked toward the grand exit, head high, never looking back. "Amelia, let's be disruptive in our honesty," Ethan called from the stage, his voice amplified by the sound system, a tech guru to the very end. Alex was already at the door, holding it open. His voice was a low rumble, laced with a threat that was anything but idle. "You have 5 seconds to take your hands off my wife before I make a scene that will be the lead story on Bloomberg by morning. You don't scream, you don't cry. You don't give a monster the satisfaction of seeing you break. You just breathe. You turn and you walk. The world can catch fire after you're gone." They made it to Leo's truck in the convention center's service lot. Lena maintained a rigid calm through the backstage corridors, down the concrete stairs, a blur of gaping, whispering faces sliding past her. The second the rusty door of the pickup slammed shut, she shattered, sucking in air as the dam of her composure finally gave way. Leo drove while Lena curled into a ball on the passenger seat, a 7 months pregnant architectural historian sobbing her heart out in a beat-up Ford F-150 on the single most important night of her career. That was the image that would be burned into her mind forever. Not the look on Ava's face, not Marcus's cold fury, just the flashing lights of the city through a tear-streaked windshield and her brother's hand a steady anchor on the gear shift. Lena spent the night in the tiny spare room of Leo's North End apartment. Leo took the lumpy couch, refusing to go back to the fire station. He came in at 6 a.m. with 2 mugs of coffee, a worn college sweatshirt, and a sketchbook. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, "All right, we draw up new blueprints, because that's what we do when some rich monster tries to condemn our foundation." Lena nodded, feeling nothing. She felt like a historic building that had been gutted by fire, leaving only a fragile, empty facade. But her architect's mind was already turning. She could draft a plan. She had backups of everything. She had digital records of every asset, every account. She would hire the most feared litigator in Boston, and she would design a new life for herself and her daughter. She thought the demolition was over. She was profoundly mistaken. 2 days after the conference, Lena took the T to their Beacon Hill brownstone to pack a bag. She walked down the cobblestone street she loved, up the granite steps she had helped restore, and held her key to the antique lock. It didn't turn. The lock had been changed. She peered through the wavy 100-year-old glass of her own front window and saw, hanging in the entryway where her favorite landscape painting should be, a hideous modern art piece she detested. A piece she knew Ava, the landscape architect, had publicly praised. He had already changed the locks. Marcus had already moved his pregnant mistress into the historic home Lena had spent 3 years restoring. When Lena called, he answered on the first ring, his voice as cool and detached as if he were discussing a zoning variance. "Lena, my counsel insisted that securing the primary asset was the first priority. You abandoned the property. The security system logs confirm your departure." "Abandoned the property?" "I emailed you the revised blueprints for our daughter's nursery on the same day you were on a yacht with your girlfriend in Monaco, Marcus. It was on our shared server. I believe it's best if all future communication goes through our attorneys." The line went dead. Lena stood on the brick sidewalk of her own street, looking up at the home where she had chosen the authentic period paint for their daughter's room, where the 3D ultrasound pictures were on the Sub-Zero fridge, where every book, every blueprint, every memory was hers. Her entire world was in that house, and he had just installed a new deadbolt. If you are ever forced out of your home, even for one night, document everything. Send a time-stamped email to your lawyer declaring that you are leaving under duress and have no intention of relinquishing your residence. Understand your legal rights before a disaster strikes, because the person you built a life with can use the very framework of that life to tear yours apart. The next blow came 2 days later. Lena tried to pay a restoration contractor from her business account. The corporate card was declined. She tried to log into their joint investment portfolio. Authorization failed. Please contact the account administrator. She called their wealth manager, a man they'd played squash with for a decade. His voice was strained. "Dr. Petrova, Mr. Thorne has consolidated all marital assets into a new single signatory trust." Lena sat in her brother's truck, parked by the harbor, and checked her personal savings account. $412, a 15-year partnership, a husband with a real estate empire worth billions, and she was left with $412. She sent Leo a simple text. He emptied it, all of it. His response was immediate. "Don't move. I'm on my way." In her brother Leo's cluttered apartment, surrounded by the smell of stale coffee and a protective rage that was the only warmth she felt, they began to strategize. Marcus had already retained Claire Sterling, the most ruthless divorce attorney in New England, a woman famous for her scorched earth litigation. Then the character assassination started. Using his influence on the city's landmark commission and his vast network of developers, a story began to spread through Boston's elite circles. Dr. Lena Petrova was a brilliant preservationist, but emotionally unstable. The pressure of her latest high-profile project, combined with the hormones of her pregnancy, had apparently triggered a serious mental health episode. Marcus was cast as the devoted, suffering husband, trying his best to manage her through a difficult time. A popular real estate blog ran a thinly veiled item about the personal struggles of high-powered professionals, never using Lena's name, but everyone in the industry knew. The ultimate humiliation came from Leo. He came home after a 48-hour shift, dropped his heavy gear by the door, and placed $4,000 in worn bills on the table. "It's all my savings," he said, his voice raw with fatigue. Lena just shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "Leo, I can't take your money." "It's not a loan," he said, his firefighter's hand covering hers. "It's what we do. You take it." He didn't need to say more. Anyone who mattered in their world had heard the rumors. A prominent philanthropist who sat on a museum board with Marcus stopped Lena in a cafe a few days later. "People are concerned, Lena," she said, her voice a practiced blend of sympathy and judgment. "I don't listen to gossip. You know that, but you should be aware of the narrative." The official assault arrived on a cold, rainy Monday. Marcus had filed a petition for sole custody of their unborn daughter, citing Lena's increasingly erratic behavior and documented emotional instability. After all, she was unemployed and living in her brother's spare room in a fourth-floor walk-up. The legal filings depicted her as a woman on the verge of a complete breakdown, while a stable, loving father fought to protect his child. Lena finally broke that night. It wasn't a dramatic, screaming collapse. She broke the way most structures do, with a silent, internal fracturing, alone in the dark. Lena stood on the narrow fire escape of her brother's building, 20 floors above the glittering lights of the financial district. It was 2 a.m. Below, the city hummed with a life that felt alien. A cold, sharp thought sliced through her despair. What if Marcus was right? What if she was the one who was broken? Maybe their daughter was better off with a father who could provide everything, not a mother sleeping on a borrowed mattress. The thought was a strange, insidious poison, a surrender she nearly accepted. And then she felt a push. A tiny, determined foot pressed hard against her ribs, a small life announcing its own plans. She slid the window open and went back inside. Her daughter, a new foundation to build on, was already there, already counting on her. Eleanor stood in the quiet of her kitchen, the Boston city lights casting long shadows across the marble floor, and she came to a decision. There was no theatrical breakdown, no shouted declaration into the void. It was a silent, steely promise from a woman who had lost everything but the new life she was carrying. She would go on the offensive. Diana Walsh's law firm consumed the top floor of a sleek skyscraper overlooking the harbor, a modern spear of glass and steel. The name on the door was simply Walsh Litigation, and the atmosphere inside smelled of expensive leather and calculated aggression. On Diana's expansive desk, a minimalist sculpture of a hawk was inscribed with a single word, "Prevail." Behind her, a framed piece of calligraphy stated, "The most effective defense is a devastating attack." Diana, known in legal circles as the Shark, was in her early 50s, a whip-smart woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She exuded the controlled intensity of someone fueled by black coffee and an unshakable belief in her own abilities. She had built a formidable reputation dismantling the empires of Boston's most powerful men on behalf of their wives. Eleanor sat before her, a tablet displaying the evidence she'd painstakingly gathered from their financial records. The images showed a string of charges to a high-end private jeweler, a secret post office box, and the purchase of a luxury condo under an opaque LLC. Diana swiped through the files, her neutral expression slowly hardening into one of cold, focused fury. When she finished, she set the tablet down, leaned across the mahogany desk, and met Eleanor's gaze. "My dear," she said, her voice a polished, dangerous purr, "we will not be asking for a fair settlement. We are going to execute a leveraged buyout of his entire life." For the first time in weeks, a ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. Diana was a nor'easter in a bespoke suit. Within a week, Diana filed a motion requesting an emergency injunction, temporary sole use of their Beacon Hill brownstone for Eleanor, and an immediate legal freeze on all real estate and financial assets held by Arthur Sterling, both personally and through his development corporation. The filing included the damning jewelry receipts, proof of wire transfers to Chloe, and a sworn affidavit from Eleanor detailing the cold financial trail that had unraveled the affair. On a crisp autumn morning, the judge granted everything. Eleanor used her key to enter her home for the first time since that terrible night. The architect's portfolio case, usually propped by the door, was gone. Arthur's personal effects were scattered about, but the house felt cold and empty, the tall, elegant windows reflecting a world that was no longer hers. Eleanor went straight to the nursery. The antique copy of Make Way for Ducklings, which she read to her unborn son each night, was on the rocking chair where she'd left it. She clutched the book, its worn cover a small comfort, and just stood there, breathing in the scent of new paint in quiet anticipation, the scent of everything she was now determined to protect. The tide was turning. She had a lawyer. She had a paper trail. She had a plan. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eleanor felt a fragile ember of an emotion she thought had been extinguished for good, hope, and that's when the counteroffensive struck. Arthur's lawyer, David Chen, filed a response that landed like a wrecking ball. The charge was breathtaking in its cruelty. Eleanor Vance, it alleged, was guilty of financial fraud, attempting to embezzle funds from their marital estate to secretly finance a new restaurant, in collusion with her business partner and presumed lover, Michael. Chen produced selectively edited email chains, bank transfer records to a holding company, and security photos of Eleanor meeting Michael at his office late at night, weaving them into a compelling narrative of deceit. The evidence was technically accurate, but the story it told was a malicious fiction. Every one of those meetings had been about the restaurant expansion that Arthur himself had enthusiastically supported for months. But without that crucial context, the emails and photos painted a clear picture of betrayal. The judge, now wary, paused the asset freeze and Eleanor's exclusive access to the brownstone, scheduling a formal hearing. Eleanor slammed her hand on the conference table, rattling a glass of water. These funds were for our joint expansion project. He knew every detail. "I'm aware," Diana said, her voice calm as she pinched the bridge of her nose. "We both are. The problem is proving it, and that buys Arthur the time he needs to bleed us dry." That night, a text from Arthur appeared on her phone. His tone was infuriatingly casual, the way it always was when he was certain he held all the cards. "Eleanor, just sign the papers. Take the offer. $2 million for your share in the properties, and we'll sort out a parenting schedule. Just let it go. It will be better for everyone, especially with the baby on the way." $2 million. For the restaurant empire she had built from scratch. For the decade of her life she had poured into their shared ambitions. For her silence. The sum wouldn't even cover the property taxes on their Boston home. Eleanor sat at their vast, empty dining table that evening, the settlement offer glowing on her tablet while a cursor blinked on the signature line. The brownstone was deathly quiet. She could feel the soft, reassuring flutter of her son moving within her. Outside, a chilly Boston wind howled against the historic window panes. She thought about just tapping the screen. She thought about how easy it would be to end the fight. She thought about the profound, soul-deep exhaustion that had settled in her bones and how simple it would be to take the money and disappear. Her best friend, Sasha, appeared in the doorway. She'd let herself in, knowing Eleanor was at a breaking point. "Don't you even consider it," Sasha said, her voice a low growl. "Sasha, I'm just so tired of fighting." "I know, But you didn't weather a public character assassination and a financial ambush just to sell your life's work for pennies on the dollar. Put the tablet down. Eleanor let the device clatter onto the table. Her brother Ben came in behind Sasha, a container of takeout in his hand. He sat down next to her, a comforting, solid presence. "Remember when you were trying to get the lease for your first location?" he asked softly. "And that landlord tried to back out at the last minute because a bigger chain offered him more money?" A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips. "I found a zoning violation on his other properties and convinced the city to launch an audit." "Precisely," Ben said, his eyes locking with hers. "Because you are not someone who backs down. You're a fighter, Elle. He's just done his best to make you forget that." The battle to unfreeze her business accounts took 3 agonizing weeks. 3 weeks of being unable to pay her staff or suppliers. 3 weeks of Arthur entertaining Chloe at galas, projecting an image of victory. 3 weeks of poisonous whispers slithering through Boston's close-knit culinary scene. But her lawyer, Diana, was a virtuoso of litigation. Her financial advisor, Michael, presented the full, unedited business plan, complete with text messages where Arthur had called the expansion idea a stroke of genius. His testimony was so thorough, so backed by documentation, and so unimpeachable that Arthur's legal team was left with nothing to cross-examine. The judge not only restored Eleanor's full control of her finances, but also issued a scathing rebuke to the opposing counsel for wasting the court's time with fabricated allegations. Diana called her from the courthouse steps, her voice electric with triumph. "We're back in business, Eleanor, and now he knows we don't bleed." Eleanor released a breath she felt she'd been holding for a month. The divorce would proceed. Diana was confident they could secure the brownstone, establish a favorable custody agreement, and win a substantial support package. For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe she would survive this. She should have known it would never be that straightforward. Chloe's name lit up her phone screen on a Tuesday night, calling from a private number. Eleanor's immediate impulse was to reject the call. "Mrs. Sterling, it's Chloe. I'm begging you, please just listen for a moment." Eleanor's hand tightened on her phone. Every instinct screamed at her to hang up, that no good could possibly come from speaking to the woman who had helped dismantle her life. But she heard something familiar in Chloe's voice, a tremor, a crack in her composure that Eleanor had heard in her own voice in the mirror for weeks. "I need to see you," Chloe urged. "It has to be in person. It's about Arthur, and it's about my baby." They met at a small, dimly lit cafe in a part of town neither of them would ever normally visit. Chloe was already there, tucked into a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She looked nothing like the polished, ambitious architect from Arthur's company photos. She looked younger, and she looked terrified. The distinct curve of her own pregnancy was now visible beneath her coat. Eleanor slid into the booth opposite her. For a long, heavy moment, the silence was absolute. Eleanor was the one who finally spoke. "Why am I here?" Chloe slid a small, encrypted flash drive across the worn tabletop. Her hands were shaking. "He told me your marriage was just a business arrangement," Ava said, her voice a choked whisper. "He said you were cold, obsessed with your work, that you hadn't shared a bed in years. He claimed he only stayed because of your public image, but that he was desperately lonely, and I fell for it. He can be so convincing, and I was 31 and wanted to believe in a perfect future, and he made me feel like the most important person in the world." She paused, drawing a ragged breath. "Last week, he told me that if I didn't sign a declaration stating I had witnessed you misappropriating project funds, he would ensure I lost custody of my son. He said his lawyers would prove I was an unstable and unfit mother before he was even born." In that instant, Lena understood. He doesn't love either of us. We're just properties to be managed. The raw truth of it settled in the cheap diner air. 2 women in a cracked vinyl booth, linked together by the meticulous cruelty of one man. Back in Leo's apartment, Lena stared at the encrypted files on her laptop. "What is all this?" she asked. "Everything," Ava's voice came, thin and frayed over the burner phone. "The offshore accounts he opened in my name, the shell corporations registered to my business address, the crypto wallets. He funneled bribes to a city councilman for a zoning change using an LLC with me listed as the sole proprietor. I had no idea. He has me as a silent partner on developments I've never even heard of. He has trapped me in this web just as completely as he's trapped you, and I never saw it coming." Amelia navigated through the file directory. These were not just business proposals. They were a blueprint for a total corporate hijacking. Records of offshore wire transfers, incorporation documents, private keys to anonymous crypto wallets. The sheer scope of Ethan's deception was staggering. For 18 months, he had been systematically siphoning her foundational research, redirecting proprietary genomic data through encrypted servers and shell corporations, engineering an exit so absolute it was not just a separation, it was a complete erasure. Her own brother Alex had found the digital breadcrumbs, but Maya had just handed her the server's master password, 97% of their primary intellectual property already integrated into a shadow company. Amelia stared at the file structure, her voice a bare whisper. "So our life, this baby, was it all just cover for a hostile takeover?" Maya's reply appeared on the secure chat, stark and digital. "For both of us." A long, sterile silence filled the encrypted channel. Amelia closed her laptop. She pictured Maya, the prodigy scientist Ethan had poached, and no longer saw the competitor she had imagined, but another professional ensnared in the same man's calculated ambition. It seemed the most critical alliance could be forged in the one place you are conditioned to feel hatred. The other woman is not always the rival. Sometimes she is simply the first casualty. You do not have to become friends. You do not have to offer forgiveness. But when someone offers you the weaponized truth, you accept it. "Thank you," Amelia typed. The two most difficult words she had ever forced herself to write. They agreed to nothing more. There was no shared moment of sisterhood. But in that one data transfer, linked only by secure protocols and a mutual betrayal, two women manipulated by the same man formed a silent alliance. He would not get away with it. When Amelia presented the files to Catherine, her lawyer stared at the screen for 3 full minutes, her jaw tightening as she scrolled through the scale of the stolen intellectual property. Finally, she met Amelia's gaze. "He didn't just have an affair, Amelia. He orchestrated a massive corporate heist. He's been planning to leave you with a bankrupt company for over a year, all while telling you how proud he was of your work." Amelia just gave a slow, deliberate nod, her ability to cry having been exhausted days ago. She was far beyond the point of grief. "So, what is our next move?" Catherine's posture became rigid. "We proceed exactly as we planned. We file the initial complaint, but now," she said, a cold, sharp smile forming on her lips, "we make it a landmark case. And we will architect this case with such care that by the time we step into that courtroom, nobody will have any doubt about the kind of man Julian Croft really is." There was one final piece of the puzzle. On a hunch, Ilara had Ben investigate the Croft family's construction history, looking for a similar pattern. He discovered something that reshaped the entire board. He called Ilara on a Thursday afternoon. "You might want to take a seat for this, boss." "I'm already sitting, Ben. Just tell me what you found." "Your father-in-law, the celebrated developer Arthur Croft. 30 years ago, he was quietly forced out of his first construction venture, an affair with a junior city planner named Isabella. It resulted in a child, a son, born in 1991. Arthur paid a fortune to make it all vanish. The payoff was laundered through the budget for a public works project." Ilara shut her eyes, a nauseating wave of understanding cresting over her. Of course, the rot was in the foundation. "And here's the part that's critical," Ben continued. "Julian found out when he was 19. He confronted his father, and Arthur told him that a man must protect his empire, no matter the cost. That was his code of ethics. That is what Arthur Croft taught his son about partnership. That deception is a required tool for building a legacy. That public image is the only asset that truly matters, that a partner is a line item to be managed, not an equal to be respected. Ilara sat with that information long after she hung up. She had no desire to use Arthur's history to destroy an old man. That wasn't her way. But she finally understood, with chilling clarity, where Julian had learned to design such elaborate deceptions. He wasn't born a monster. He was engineered to be one. The autumn season in Chicago was sharp and relentless. The wind coming off Lake Michigan had a bitter edge. The light cast long, cold shadows between the skyscrapers, and the city buzzed with the energy of finance and ambition. The annual Urban Development Gala was about to kick off, and the city was showcasing its architectural and economic might, the same way Julian had performed his role as a husband, with impeccable design and a completely hollow core. Ilara stood at the head of a long table in their home office, a space they had repurposed into a war room. Sarah's legal briefs were in a crisp, intimidating pile. Ben's forensic accounting charts glowed on a large monitor, and Liam, her brother, had covered a glass wall with a complex timeline of Julian's financial fraud, circling key wire transfers with a red marker like a general mapping an attack. "Okay, everyone," Liam said, tapping the glass. "Tonight is the Meridian Tower Gala. Julian is hosting a private reception for the investors and the board of trustees in the Sky Lounge. He's billing it as a toast to our shared vision." Her father, a retired civil engineer, stood near the window, his arms folded across his chest. "And for reasons I cannot comprehend, Ilara still intends to go." Ilara glanced up from the affidavits she was signing. "He sent the invitation as a joint announcement from both of us to the entire board. If I don't show up, he controls the narrative that I'm unstable and emotionally compromised." Sarah, patched in on a video conference, gave a decisive nod. "She is 100% right, and frankly, this gives us the perfect platform. Julian is arrogant. He thinks the initial legal filings have forced Ilara into a defensive position. He has no clue that Chloe has cooperated. He has no clue we have copies of the doctored structural reports from his offsite server. He will never see this coming." Liam's expression was tight with worry. "So the plan is to set off a bomb at your own masterpiece's unveiling? This is the biggest night of your professional life." Ilara shook her head. "The most influential journalists from the architectural press are already on their way, Liam. I made sure of it. They think they're coming for an exclusive first look at the tower's design innovations. What they're going to get," she said, pausing for effect, "is a much more important story." It was a perfectly executed counter-strategy. The grand sky lounge of the tower felt almost normal for a moment. Almost. Ilara sent a text on her phone. "Ben, are we locked in?" Ben's reply was immediate and clear. The accounting ledgers showing the fraudulent transfers, cross-referenced, Chloe's sworn video testimony, digitally notarized and secured, the original architectural blueprints from the wiped hard drives, fully restored, and the medical confirmation. The medical confirmation. Ilara had been trying to push it from her mind. After Chloe's frightened confession, Ben had hired a private investigator to discreetly confirm a few details. The report had landed in her email that morning. Julian Croft, the celebrated real estate mogul and proud father-to-be, was not going to be a father at all. The man who had publicly detonated his marriage for this new family, this proof of his legacy, had built it on nothing. Chloe had never even been pregnant. Ilara had stared at the document for 5 full minutes before the reality of it sank in. Then she had placed her phone on the table and let out a single sharp laugh. It wasn't a sound of happiness, but the sort of raw, splintered noise that escapes when the crushing, cosmic absurdity of a situation becomes too vast to contain. "He gambled $1 billion skyscraper for a ghost," she had texted Ben, and now Ben had replied, "We're about to hand him the invoice." Ilara spent the next 2 days in a state of intense, quiet focus, getting ready. She rehearsed her statement until her voice became a cool, objective instrument. She memorized the file names, the account numbers, and the transfer dates. Her brother Liam stopped by to do a final technical run-through. "I'll be patched into the venue's audio-visual system from the control room," he explained, holding up a small flash drive. "The moment you give me the word, the main presentation on the video wall will switch to our feed." Ilara nodded. "And that reporter from the Tribune, Mark Davies?" Liam went on. "He's been digging into the city's permitting process for months. He thinks he's coming tonight for a nice dinner and some off-the-record conversation. It's just a lucky coincidence that his table is right at the front." A thin, humorless smile touched Ilara's lips. "You have a gift for lucky coincidences, Liam, kid. I'm the absolute best." Her father, the retired engineer, came into the room holding a small, encrypted radio. "I'll be monitoring their security channels from the car service downstairs." "You don't have to be there, Dad," Ilara said. Her father gave her the same quiet, unwavering look he had since she was a little girl. Since she was 10, and he was 42, and she had gotten lost at a construction site, and he had found her without a trace of panic in his eyes. He said simply, "Yes, I do." On the evening of the gala, Ilara stood before the panoramic window of her apartment, looking out at the glittering lights of Chicago. She was wearing a structured architectural maternity gown in a deep sapphire blue. No jewelry. Her face was a mask of serene composure. She studied the woman in the reflection for a long, quiet moment. The woman who had stumbled upon a hidden set of blueprints late one night was gone. That woman had been broken and betrayed. This woman was tired and had lost a future she would have given anything to believe in. But she was not afraid. She picked up her tablet. The screen showed 3 folders: blueprints, bribes, betrayal. She tapped each one, checking that they were ready. She walked to the front door. Her brother was waiting in the hall. "Liam, are you sure you're ready?" she asked into her phone, using the phrase they had decided on. Her brother's voice was steady. "I'm watching the final play. Call me when it's over. I'll be there before dawn." She took a deep, centering breath. "Hey, Liam, am I going to get through this?" Ilara could almost see him on the other end of the line, this brilliant 20-year-old who had sacrificed his semester abroad, spending night after night in a cold data center helping her excavate the truth. "Yeah, Ilara," he said softly, "you're going to be brilliant." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she actually believed him. The Croft penthouse on the 70th floor of the Park Tower was a monument to cold, calculated success. It was a space of steel and plate glass with a climate-controlled wall of exotic ferns and a commanding view of the Chicago skyline. It felt less like a home than a corporate showroom, which was exactly how Julian Croft preferred it. Ilara arrived at 9 p.m. sharp. She rode up in the silent, private elevator, the beat of her heart a steady drum against her ribs. She took out her phone, glanced at the one encrypted file, and then stepped into the belly of the beast. Julian Croft opened the door himself, a study in relaxed power in a custom navy tuxedo, looking composed, confident, and entirely in charge. He gave her a smile that belonged on a magazine cover, as if she were a cherished guest and not the woman whose career and heart he had systematically tried to demolish. "Ilara," he said, his voice as smooth as polished marble, "welcome. I am so happy you could make it." She moved past him into the sky lounge of the Meridian. The air smelled of orchids and ambition. The city's power players were already there: Arthur Croft, Julian's formidable father, and the dynasty's patriarch. 2 investment bankers from Zurich, the lead attorney for Croft Developments, and Chloe standing by an architectural model, her hand resting protectively on the curve of her pregnant stomach. Her face was a study in calm, a mask of polished composure she'd perfected over the years. Clara's gaze flickered to her brother, Marcus, for a fraction of a second. He gave a slight, almost invisible dip of his chin. It was the only signal she needed. He was in the press pit. blending in as a tech journalist for some online publication. Julian had never even bothered to learn his name. Arrogance was always Julian's most exploitable code. The keynote began at Ether AICon. Holographic logos danced in the air. Julian Vance, her husband, delivered a slick, inspiring monologue about innovation, disruption, and the future of artificial intelligence in San Francisco. Clara watched his father, Elias, a titan of venture capital, nervously fiddling with his billion-dollar smartwatch. The conversation buzzing around her was a symphony of funding rounds, user acquisition costs, and server scalability. No one said the word affair. No one mentioned the separation agreement she'd refused to sign. The biggest liability in the room was wearing a custom suit, and everyone was too busy applauding his vision. Halfway through his speech, Julian paused, smiling at the crowd. The lights softened. "I want to thank you all for believing in this journey," he began, his charisma filling the auditorium. "This past year has been one of recalibration. I've made some personal miscalculations, but my core operating principle has always been radical transparency. I see tonight as the launch of version 2.0. He paused, a master of the dramatic beat. "I asked Clara to be here because it's time to strengthen our primary partnership. For the future of this family, for the future of Ether AI, for the future of this industry." He finished to a roar of applause, giving Clara a look that was a perfect simulation of remorse. Clara let the sound fade for 3 seconds. Then she walked onto the stage. A current of confusion and anticipation shot through the room. "Julian believes in new versions," she said, her voice amplified, crisp and unwavering throughout the hall. "So do I, and I believe the best way to launch one is with a public audit." She glanced at the enormous LED screen behind the stage. Then she uttered a single name, Marcus. Instantly, the Ether AI logo was replaced by a dark, sleek interface titled Project Chimera. This interface is running a live query on a secure, mirrored copy of Ether AI's internal servers, she announced. Here, you will see the complete transaction ledger for a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, holding just over $22 million. Funds that were siphoned from our seed funding under the guise of data acquisition costs over the last 2 fiscal years. The auditorium fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Julian's smile didn't fall. It seemed to glitch. "Clara, what is this?" he stammered, but she continued as if he hadn't spoken. She nodded to the screen. "And this is a Slack channel. In it, Julian is coaching Anya on how to falsify performance metrics for our flagship algorithm, promising her a director-level position and a significant equity grant in exchange for her silence." Every eye in the room darted toward Anya Sharma, the company's star coder. She was shaking, but her gaze was fixed on Julian. Her voice was quiet, but the microphone on the nearby table picked it up perfectly. "He said the baby was our true IPO. He said it was the start of a new dynasty. He said a lot of things that didn't align with the data. And 2 weeks ago, he said if I didn't back his play, he'd make sure my name was blacklisted from every tech incubator in Silicon Valley." Julian's face was the color of unpainted drywall. "Anya, what have you done?" Her chin rose. "I did what any good developer does, Julian. I saved my work." Clara gestured to the screen for the last time. The tension in the room was suffocating. "This is a cryptographically signed paternity analysis," she stated, "from a certified biotech lab." Anya consented to the procedure. "The results are stored on a public blockchain, making them immutable and completely verifiable." She tapped her tablet, and the report filled the screen, its conclusions stark and digital. Paternity analysis. The alleged father is excluded as the biological father. Probability of paternity, 0%. The silence that followed was not just an absence of noise, it was a vacuum. It was the sound of a unicorn startup imploding. Julian stared, his mouth opening and closing silently. It's a deep fake, a fabrication. She's trying to sink the company." Marcus stood up from his seat in the press area. His voice was calm, professional, and utterly lethal. The financial data is pulled from your own version control history on GitHub. The Slack Conversations API logs are admissible in the state of California, and that lab's cryptographic signature on the blockchain is unbreakable. I would be more than happy to authenticate every single byte of this for a court, Mr. Vance. And given the evidence of investor fraud, I imagine the SEC will want to have a chat very soon. Elias Vance, his father, hauled himself to his feet, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His voice was a low growl. "Julian, what have you done?" Cornered and broken, Julian whirled on his father, his voice raw with a lifetime of resentment. "The same thing you did to get the patent for the processor that launched your entire career." The room went dead. Elias crumpled back into his chair as if his spine had been removed. His mother-in-law stared at him, a look of slow, dawning horror spreading across her face. 40 years of philanthropic donations and cover stories and her daughter's husband had just dynamited the bedrock of it all. Dr. Eleanor Vance said nothing else. It wasn't her data to present. But the accusation landed with the force of a physical blow, and every board member in the room understood its meaning. Eleanor picked up her leather portfolio. She looked at Arthur one final time. "I didn't come here for your stock options," she said, her voice completely even. "I came here because you spent 10 years making me feel like one of your research assets. I just needed to stand in this room with everyone whose validation you crave and remind you that I was the lead scientist in my own life all along." She walked to the exit, leaving the corporate wreckage in her wake. Her brother, the cybersecurity analyst who had been quietly observing, rose and stood at her side. As they reached the glass doors, Eleanor looked back. She glanced at him, then at the assembled venture capitalists, then at the untouched bottles of mineral water, and said, "For what it's worth, the ethical AI initiative was always my vision. You never had that kind of foresight." Eleanor stepped out onto the balcony into the brisk Boston night. A cool wind was sweeping in from the harbor. Across the Seaport District, the city lights twinkled, a view she had always adored. She breathed in deeply, held it for a moment, and let it out in a slow, visible cloud. Her hands shook, and her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but a real smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of a scientist tasting a proven hypothesis for the very first time. The law offices of Chen and Associates in downtown Boston were a monument of steel and glass, a symbol of modern corporate power. This wasn't a research lab or a university gala. There was no soft lighting or polite applause, only the stark, impartial fluorescence of a Boston boardroom. Dr. Eleanor Vance sat with her counsel, a man named Mr. Chen. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry, no smartwatch. Her hands formed a protective cup around the curve of her stomach, a gesture she'd found herself making unconsciously through every grant proposal, every data review, every single public moment where she needed to project a calm she hadn't felt in months. Across the mahogany table, Arthur Vance sat with his team. He looked smaller here, stripped of his custom-tailored suits and keynote speaker confidence. The effortless charisma that had built a biotech empire was gone, replaced by a generic gray suit and the stunned expression of a man watching his life's research go up in flames. The board meeting took 3 days, but each hour stretched into a lifetime. Eleanor's counsel was a quiet storm. He laid out the evidence with surgical precision, rebuilding the story one encrypted file at a time. The falsified data sets from a phantom research institute, the wire transfers to offshore accounts labeled lab equipment, the hidden server logs, the deed to the Cambridge condo, the secret research protocols. Every data point, every forged signature, every secret he thought was buried under layers of prestige. He brought a senior data analyst to the stand, a man who Arthur had tried to pressure into manipulating the results, who testified about the phantom clinical trials. He summoned a junior researcher from Arthur's firm, a young woman who had noticed the consistent and sizable payments to an unknown biomedical consultant and began documenting everything. Her files were the final thread, tying Arthur's personal ambition to a systematic conspiracy to defraud his own company's investors. Finally, he presented the sworn deposition of Chloe. Chloe walked to the stand carefully, one hand also resting on her pregnant belly. She kept her eyes fixed on the legal counsel, refusing to look at Arthur. After taking the oath, she told them everything: how they met at a biotech summit in Geneva, how he swore his marriage was a research partnership, a brand they had built together that was too valuable to dissolve, how he had enrolled her in a private trial funded by the slow-motion theft from another woman's work, how he had threatened to ruin her career when she found out the truth and tried to withdraw. She only broke once, when she described the moment she understood the brilliant scientist she loved didn't exist. He was a character he played, she said, her voice trembling, and my entire future was just another one of his experiments. The opposing counsel attempted to paint her as a disgruntled research subject, claiming she was testifying to secure a favorable payout. Chloe looked directly at him. I am testifying because my child deserves to grow up knowing that discovering the truth is difficult, but living with fabricated data is a price no one should have to pay. A heavy silence settled in the room. Mr. Chen's closing argument was under 20 minutes long. He used no dramatic gestures or loud pronouncements. He spoke with the steady assurance of someone who knew the facts were the only weapons he needed. Esteemed board members, he started, this is not a complicated story. This is about a man who built a partnership and then plotted its corruption, who sold innovation and then cashed it in, who took the woman he promised to build a legacy with and systematically drained her intellectual property, her credibility, and her future. He didn't do this in a moment of weakness, but through 18 months of deliberate, calculated fraud. The data is irrefutable. The digital records were irrefutable, and the code of law has no room for emotion. She paused. My client is not seeking sympathy. She is seeking what is rightfully hers. In this situation, justice is nothing more than restoring a life that was so systematically dismantled. The judge, a man named Arthur Vance, who had overseen Suffolk County Superior Court for a quarter century and was famous for his disdain of financial gamesmanship, rendered his verdict the following morning. The court finds the evidence of intellectual property theft and the calculated concealment of marital assets to be both comprehensive and deeply unsettling. The defendant orchestrated a complex web of deceit that involved phantom corporations, the brazen transfer of biotech patents, and the methodical financial isolation of his wife. Clara's hands were clenched together in her lap. Miss Albright rested a reassuring hand on her forearm, a silent gesture of solidarity. This court awards full title of the Beacon Hill townhouse to Clara Reed. Furthermore, upon the child's birth, primary custody will be granted to the plaintiff. The defendant is mandated to provide child support in accordance with state formulas. 75% of all declared marital assets, inclusive of all funds reclaimed from the international accounts, are awarded to the plaintiff. The defendant's criminal business activities will be forwarded to the district attorney's office for a complete investigation. Clara heard the words, but they seemed to belong to someone else's victory. A woman who had strategically waged her war instead of staggering from one gut-wrenching revelation to the next. Julian was led out by his attorneys. He paused at the doorway, his eyes finding Clara's. His face showed no anger, no resentment. It was a look of pure devastation, the expression of a man truly seeing his own reflection for the first time and hating the stranger staring back at him. I was building the future, he said, his voice barely a whisper. For us. Clara held his gaze, unblinking. That's the greatest lie, Julian. You were never building anything. You were just acquiring. And for a decade, I was too blind to see the difference. He turned and vanished from her life. Clara remained seated as the courtroom slowly emptied. Miss Albright began closing her briefcase. Marcus, her oldest friend, leaned against the back wall, hands in his pockets, allowing her a moment. "How are you holding up for real?" Miss Albright asked gently. Clara considered the question. She thought about the encrypted server partition, the falsified patent filings, the offshore wire transfers, and the video logs of him with Simone that had incinerated her reality. She thought about the $206 remaining in her bank account and the shock of seeing her own home's security footage at 2 a.m. "I feel like the board has been wiped clean," she said at last. "And I feel like I have to invent a whole new game, and I'm not sure which feeling is more overwhelming right now." Miss Albright nodded once. "Take your time. The best designs are never rushed." 6 months later, autumn had settled over Boston, the kind of brilliant, crisp autumn that made the coming New England winter feel like a worthy bargain. Jewel-toned chrysanthemums spilled from window boxes, the scent of salt water and roasting chestnuts hung in the air, and the faint clang of the tea was a steady, rhythmic pulse. Clara was on her rooftop terrace. Her asterisk terrace. The word still felt precious and strange. The space he'd declared off-limits for her frivolous gardening was now a riot of thyme and lavender and the stubborn mint he'd always complained about. Maya was fast asleep in her bassinet, lulled by the harbor breeze. Her friend Marcus was on the deck with a local IPA, watching over them with the comfortable silence of a man whose loyalty was a bedrock. He had spent the last month helping her establish new, completely secure financial systems. This house, he had told her, deserves a firewall that actually works, with no back doors. Things were not perfect. Clara made a pact with herself to be honest about that. She still had nightmares where the biometric locks to the house wouldn't recognize her, and she could hear Maya crying from the nursery but couldn't reach her. She was seeing a therapist, a brilliant woman named Dr. Finch, whose office overlooked the Charles River and who never once suggested she should be past it by now. Some weeks felt like trench warfare. Some mornings she would awaken and the first thing that filled her head was one of Julian's casual dismissals disguised as a compliment, and she would have to breathe through her morning coffee and remind herself that his version of her was no longer canonical. Her own intuition was, she was painstakingly learning to trust it again. It was the most difficult work she had ever undertaken. Her friend Anya had created a small gathering for women who had been blindsided by their powerful partners. She called it the reboot because, she'd quipped, the whole phoenix rising from the ashes thing was too messy for her minimalist gallery. They met on Thursdays in Anya's Seaport Gallery, a group of 5 now, and there was always dark coffee and sometimes tears and always a deep, cleansing laughter. Anya had discovered a new purpose. She was a natural leader. Simone had given birth in May to a little boy. She and Clara were not friends. There were no texts or lunches to manufacture a bond where there was only a shared gaping wound. 2 women who had weathered the same hurricane simply found their separate, quiet ports. When Maya was born, Simone had sent a gift, a simple, elegant silver music box with a note that read, "Thank you for showing me what strength looks like." Clara sent a donation in her name to a foundation supporting women in STEM. Patricia Caldwell had left her husband in April. At 67, after 42 years of willful ignorance, she bought a stunning penthouse overlooking Boston Common and enrolled in the landscape architecture program at Harvard she had secretly dreamed about. "It's the first time in my entire adult life I've picked my own flowers," she told Clara over tea in Clara's sunroom. Clara never mentioned the affair. She knew Patricia knew in the way mothers always seem to, and it was not Clara's burden to carry. Patricia was cultivating a new life, and that was more than enough. Robert Caldwell had vanished from the venture capital world in a flurry of hushed speculation. The official story cited a need for a sabbatical. The reality was a different story, one exchanged in quiet whispers at the city's oldest country clubs. He and Patricia had not spoken a single word since the day she moved out. And Julian? Julian was confined to his apartment, awaiting trial for securities fraud and intellectual property theft. His power had evaporated, His reputation was a smoldering ruin. His name was now a cautionary tale on tech blogs, but Clara found herself thinking of him less and less. Every day she didn't think of him at all felt like a victory, like she was reclaiming territory in her own mind. On a cool autumn evening, Clara stood on the balcony of her new architecture studio after her daughter Maya was asleep. The city lights glittered along the river, a beautiful, steady rhythm. The studio was silent. It was the kind of silence that felt like peace, not absence. Her phone lit up. It was a text from her friend Anya. "Celebratory dinner tomorrow. My place. We're toasting to new beginnings, and I have several bottles of very expensive champagne." Clara smiled, a genuine smile that started deep inside and turned into a quiet laugh of pure release. A laugh of liberation, of knowing she had made it to the other side. She couldn't recall the last time she felt so light. Maybe it was a few weeks ago when her friend Marcus was helping her put together a new drafting table and they dissolved into a silly debate, making baby Maya shriek with laughter at the scene. He protected her newfound tranquility as if his own life depended on it, and maybe that was the core of a new beginning. You could never get back the years you lost or have your faith completely restored, but you could collect new moments, quieter moments, but infinitely more real. A daughter's first smile, a loyal friend who shows up with forensic software and takeout when your world is on fire, and who stays to help you sweep up the wreckage. A few nights before, Clara had been organizing old digital archives. She found a picture of the three of them, Julian, their infant daughter Maya, and herself, at a tech gala celebrating their firm's latest funding round, all of them smiling for the cameras. Maya had pointed to the screen and asked the question Clara had been rehearsing for. "Were we a happy family then, Mommy?" Clara held the tablet, seeing the image with clear eyes for the very first time. She saw her own smile, which she now recognized as forced. She saw Liam's bright, curious face, and she saw Arthur's hand on her shoulder, a gesture she now understood not as support, but as a claim of intellectual ownership. "We were happy, sweetie," she said quietly. Every one of those moments was a valid data point. But sometimes, being a good scientist means knowing when your hypothesis is wrong and it's time to design a new experiment. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Liam had accepted this with the straightforward logic of a child and returned to building a model spaceship, a creation that was beautifully imperfect and entirely his. Now, Eleanor stood in her lab, gazing out at the Boston skyline. She thought about the woman she was just 18 months ago, the one who saw Arthur's name on a groundbreaking medical journal and felt nothing but immense pride. She thought about the woman who, days later, followed a nagging inconsistency in the clinical data and discovered a series of private trials that made no sense, a discovery that led to an encrypted server and payments to a boutique fertility clinic. She thought of the woman who felt the world fracture at a medical tech expo after seeing that clinic's head of research wearing a prototype of Arthur's newest biosensor. She wished she could go back and speak to that woman, not to warn her the pain was a necessary part of the process. She wanted to tell her that the most devastating discovery of her life would not invalidate her life's work, that the frantic quiet she once confused with tranquility would finally give way to a profound sense of peace, that her unborn child would be extraordinary, that she would be extraordinary, that the nagging inconsistency she'd spotted in his research, a thread she pulled for months, would unravel a lie and ultimately buy her freedom. If you're listening to this and any aspect of Eleanor's experience feels familiar, if you've ever been manipulated into doubting your own expertise by the very person who swore to support you, I need you to hear this. You are not losing your mind. Your intellect is your greatest ally, and you are not walking this path alone. The journey doesn't start with walking away. It starts with believing you are worthy of more. Because you are. You always have been. Eleanor rested her laptop on the cool glass of her high-rise balcony. She was 7 months pregnant with her new life, and as she hugged her knees to her chest, she watched the sunset bleed across Boston, igniting a constellation of city lights that felt like they belonged only to her. Tomorrow, she had a grant proposal meeting for a new research project, her son Liam's robotics club at 10, and a routine ultrasound in the afternoon. Tomorrow was beautifully, wonderfully normal, and she now understood that normal was the most magnificent thing in the world after you fought your way back to it. She rose, stretched her back, and stepped inside, sliding the bolt across her front door. It was her asterisk front door now. She tiptoed past Liam's room, smiling at the sound of his soft, even breathing. He was safe. He was home. She then slipped into her own bed, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, sleep was not an escape, but a welcome comfort, bringing dreams that were entirely her own. This narrative was painstakingly researched, crafted, and produced by our creative team to tell a resonant story with genuine emotional depth. Each character, every location, and every single word was chosen with a singular goal: to offer strength, validation, and hope to anyone who has ever had their expertise denied. We appreciate you watching, we appreciate you listening, and we appreciate you being part of a movement that understands our stories have the power to change our world.